kid sees your country being like, derided or smeared on TV and among peers, they're not going to want to speak it. They're going to feel really awkward and they don't want to get excluded. Even if they're tiny, they can still feel it. But the other theory is you have to speak to the child at all times, and that's the only way to do it. But really, who has time to speak? For those of you who have kids or who were parented by an immigrant, who had their parents, or do you speak to your child in that language, in your native language at all times? Can you raise your hand? 90% of the time? That's good, yeah.
What's like parents?
Yeah. Well, maybe they don't speak another language. Maybe they don't speak English. But actually, it's not sustainable, because ultimately, even studies show that if both languages are spoken, English and the other language, usually English takes over, even if the two are spoken equally in and out of the house. And frankly, a lot of times people don't have the time to devote that. If you come home from work really tired, you are not going to force your kid to speak that language. Or there's a theory, one parent, one language. If one parent, the dad can speak, Urdu, and the mom can speak Russian. They're not going to always do this because it's very hard to commit to. So it's unrealistic too, but there are ways of doing it. Even if you mix languages, you can still get a kid to speak your language, if you speak Russian and English, for example. Maybe they don't want to pick it up and you don't want to force them. Maybe they'll pick it up later in college. A person can become bilingual at any age. Maybe it's a little harder when they're older, but it can definitely happen. And there are, in fact, stories of people going to college and suddenly expressing a lot of interest in speaking their language so that roommate doesn't understand them when they speak on the phone. Or they just feel like they really miss mom's borscht or something. And there are real stories like this from all kinds of languages. There are many ways to screw up your kid, but not imparting them with Russian only is not one of them.
Well, that actually raises an interesting topic. So I think most of us, at least I did, because I spoke Russian with my parents. Russian was the language that I spoke to my children, not primarily out of a great love of Dostoevsky or Tolstoy, but because I wanted them to be able to speak to my parents. That was really the most important thing for me. But I start thinking about the fact that people say, well, shouldn't you teach your child your native language? And I go, okay, so Russian is the language that I speak as a child, and it is that the language my parents speak. But it's not really our native language in the definition of native language, and that since we're sitting here at UJA and we're the Russian-speaking group of UJA, I sometimes ask myself why, for lack of a, let's use a popular term, am I teaching them this colonialist language? And why am I forcing my children to learn the language of people who used it not in the nicest of ways? So how do you deal with that kind of thing? And I'm sure many of the communities that you interviewed face very similar things, that they're Indians and all sorts of other groups that are teaching their children a language that has at times been used against them. So how do you deal with that?
Exactly. If it wasn't for the revolution, we'd be speaking Yiddish right now, right, together. I think everybody answers this question very differently, right? It is a colonialist language. It's been forced upon us. And I mean, even just in the last 2 years plus, so much has changed. It's like you speak to people who are, not really related to these current events. How have you been? Oh, I'm just doing this keto diet. Well, what about you? Oh, just dealing with a couple of wars going on affecting all of my family members. Oh, what wars is that? Where is Ukraine? Yeah.
As my son said, so many people have an amazing amount of opinions on a country that 2 weeks ago they couldn't find on a map.
Yeah, or protests, right? They're not sure what they stand for. But yeah, since the war began, my book came out right before the war started and Russia attacked Ukraine. I've actually met people during talks, one woman was pregnant with her first child, and she was Ukrainian from Ukraine, and she said she's always spoken Russian to her family and to her friends, but now she doesn't want to teach Ukrainian to her child because she feels it's, she obviously has very strong feelings since it's a language of the invader of her homeland. But she doesn't know Ukrainian well enough to speak Ukrainian to her child. So that puts her in a very difficult situation. Because when you speak to your child, it's not necessarily what language you speak, it's about connecting, right, and expressing yourself. And I think in my case, I've been very vocal to my kids about, the Soviet history, Russian history, obviously the war, like when the war started, I think when my son was 6 at the time, he was like drawing all the ways to like destroy Putin and like throw them in a garbage can and like find the place where he hides. And my daughter was doing a donation, like she was doing like friendship bracelets. It was actually one of her simpler designs to raise money. I think for Cash for Refugees she did it for. She should have done it for UGA. Maybe she will next. So we were very aware, and when they speak Russian, they understand what the connections to the very difficult political and historical climate. But I think it's important to have those conversations without scaring them from speaking it, because if there is shame, they're not going to want to speak it. And there are many ways people want to learn another language, or bilingual kindergarten and so on. Kindergartens, I mean, it's good for your focus, attention span, executive function, right? Multitasking. It's proven to be really have really positive effects long term. Bilingualism can stave off dementia by 4 to 5 years. During my research, I spoke to a researcher who actually worked in the studies. It's really interesting. It makes people more empathetic. Maybe even learning to read a little bit is a little bit easier. And it's easier to learn a third language and a fourth language. Just keep on adding them on. But for a lot of us, like you said, Alina, it's about something that's a lot more personal and deep. It's about connecting to your roots, and connecting to our family members and not feeling like we've just completely severed all of those links to something that's a really huge part of our identity. And what has it been like for you? Like when you speak Russian to your kids and
well, as I
teach
said,
them?
for me, speaking Russian to my kids had nothing to do with Russian culture and Russian heritage. It had to do with connecting them to my parents
Exactly.
and everything else, which actually brings me to the question for you of, is it possible to separate a language from a culture? Can you teach a language without teaching all the cultural things that come with it? Just sometimes a language has words for some things, and I'm always fascinated by things that a language doesn't have words for, and that just sort of takes the culture piece of it. It's can you separate it, and if it's possible, how do you do that?
Maybe there are some countries perhaps in Europe or in Asia that have multilingualism as part of their educational system, but I don't think it's really possible for the majority of us, right, to separate culture and language. Maybe that's how I was learning English in the Soviet Union, which is why I thought finger is pronounced as finger, which is what our teacher taught us. But I don't think it's possible, and it comes with, with the history and with a messy history, but also with a lot of things that simply cannot be translated, right? The jokes, the singing, just the way of connecting, the toska, right? That word, and I don't know, so probably so many others.
So that brings us to, we definitely should. You've named the cognitive benefits, you've named the medical benefits. What are sort of the benefits within a family of having a second, well, I mean, for one of the things that, as you mentioned, people in college want to learn a second language so that the roommate doesn't understand them. My daughter and I, we do enjoy sometimes going out in public and speaking and not being understood, although very often people do. You think you're in a safe space, and then just people pop up and they do speak it. So I want to talk a little bit, is there a bonding element? Is there something about sort of us against the world that comes with sharing a language that isn't the language of the general population?
Absolutely, and that's also connected to the phenomenon of code switching, where you switch languages depending on where you are. I mean, sometimes there's no word to express that, what you want to say in the language you're speaking, and sometimes it just shows belonging, and it's not always even conscious. We do it subconsciously to connect to a certain group of people that we're interacting with. Yeah, or to be a spy. Not that kind of spy, right?
The good kind.
The good spy.
So let's back up a little bit. Before you parent with an accent, you also cover in your book dating with an accent, or at least you mentioned that your husband is American, my husband is American. I'm sure people are in that situation. So tell us a little bit about your own personal experience and the research that you did about just connecting with someone on a partner level when you have different languages, which, as we just said, comes with completely different cultures and expectations.
Yeah. So there's a chapter in my book called The Beat Test, and it basically describes my experience like trying to explain my culture and my food to people that I dated who were not Russian speaking at some point pretty early on. And at one point I invited like somebody who was Italian to have like salad olivier, and he was making fun of it. He's like, this is Italian, we have this in Sicily. It's like, this is not a pea, this is a caper. I'm like, screw that. So we didn't date after that. Like, people like, somebody made fun of boiled chicken that my parents presented to them lovingly, and so that didn't work out. I mean, there were other reasons, of course, right? It didn't work out. But there was a point that actually I took my now husband to the Russian vodka room and actually tried to like woo him by making food. I was like, I can cook, I can boil you a potato. And he's like, oh, this is the best boiled potato I've ever had. He's like, good, let me put some sour cream on it. Sour cream, oh, this is so delicious. And of course, and he's from the Midwest, so he kind of likes this whole potato thing. But I mean, giving somebody a boiled potato, it's not like the sexiest thing, right? It's a thing. I mean, I don't know what you guys are into. Usually not.
No judgment.
Yeah, no, it's cool. It's cool. But eventually, we came to the Russian vodka room, and I offered him selodka под шубой, and he tasted that, and he was like, wow, this is just like my mom's cooking. I was like, awesome. So I got him something else, and yeah, and at the end of the date, I asked the waiter to take our photograph, and that's the one, when we got engaged 2 months later, that's the one I put on Facebook to announce our engagement. So I think selodka под шубой really did it. But really though, in interviews that I conducted with families where one partner is from one culture and the other one is from a different culture, cultures themselves don't actually cause problems, the fact that cultures are different. What causes problems is just maybe different personal qualities. It doesn't really have to do with where a person is from or what language they speak. But food was just, I guess it made it a little bit easier to understand how a person thinks about the world. I've had friends who basically would say, like, a friend from Uzbekistan would be asked, like, oh, do you ride donkeys? And she's like, what? And I'd be like, oh, I Googled that, and I heard that you guys ride donkeys. She's like, yeah, I have a weekend donkey and a weekday donkey. And the guy's like, that's cool. So, I mean, that didn't go very far, but it doesn't have to do with the culture, it just has to do with the person's mindset and just their understanding of the world, and I think just respect or think stories like that. What about you?
Well, when we met, my husband and I just celebrated our 25th wedding anniversary in January.
Mazel tov.
Thank you. And when we met, he was quite terrified of beets. And that sort of transferred to a terror of borscht. And slowly we've got, it's the kind of thing where the people around him would eat borscht, and then borscht would sort of be next to him, and then he would eat it. And now he even puts sour cream in it. And you were just saying the other day how you found new uses for sour cream thanks to Russian cuisine. So that worked out. And
the haunting of borscht, look back and it's inching closer and closer.
25 years of borscht inching closer to you. Well, and we were actually just saying beforehand how my daughter was surprised to find out that the Soviet Union wasn't all black and white. See, everybody takes a moment to ponder that, because she'd only seen photographs in black and white. So did you know that the Soviet Union was actually in color? That was a surprise. So you're talking about donkeys. It just, that story made me think about that. And I remember going to school and I would ask questions like, does anyone ever smile in the Soviet Union? So...
Yet.
But another conversation coming back to parenting is, we were actually having this discussion among the group as we were planning this, and one of the things we were saying is those people who, for instance, want to practice things like gentle parenting. And there are no words for that in Russian. It's like there's just some concepts that are non-translatable. So if you want to talk to your kids, as I said, I'm always fascinated by what a language doesn't have words for. Like in English, there's love and there's like. But in Russian, there's just люблю, unless I'm missing something. Nравится, but that's more I favor it. It doesn't. To me, it doesn't have the same connotation. No, okay. So I've been wrong for a long time. I'm comfortable with that. But it's just the kind of thing. There's some things you want to take American parenting principles, but you want to do them in Russian, but they don't even have the words for it. So how do you handle something like that?
Well, I think the biggest, to me, I think the biggest issue is, how do we not traumatize our kids by having this very authoritative.
That's what I was asking.
Yeah.
Traumatize our kids.
Well, first, I guess not beating kids, like not beating them up, or like insulting them, or having teachers beat them or throw like cans of paint in art class at their head. Maybe that was just me.
No, I had an American teacher who threw chalk, and then if he didn't get attention, he threw staplers. So I think that's more of an individual thing.
I'm sorry that happened. I had a teacher who, a history teacher, who I accidentally took like a wrong notebook when I was in elementary school and started looking at it. It looked the same as a history book, but it actually was an English or Russian type notebook. And she saw me not, looking at it, not listening to her, and she grabbed it from me and she tore it into pieces and she threw it on the floor. And then she was like, "Lousy intelligentsia, pshuvi intelligentsia." Like they were like always conspiring against me. My grandfathers and fathers stood at the factories and worked hard, and they were trying to sabotage us. And I was like, oh, okay. Well, I guess at the time I already knew I was Jewish, but that happened a couple of years later. But I guess she helped me understand. So going back to that,
traumatizing children. So don't do that.
Do not. If you were wondering, that's not okay to do. But I think corporal punishment was very common in Russia and the Soviet Union, and a lot of it is parenting. A lot of it is just the poverty and the trauma that was untreated in, the PTSD that stems from, obviously, the Holocaust, World War II, that's what, then you have, like, the war in Afghanistan. So, obviously, people didn't talk about feelings. It wasn't supposed to be discussed. Even now, I've spoken to therapists that work with a lot of Russian-speaking populations, and they say also, like, oh, I'm not supposed to talk about feelings. I can't talk about feelings with my family. Feelings just don't exist. Not even to mention diagnosis of certain, conditions, mental health conditions that maybe would be good to be diagnosed, but that's considered a weakness. And that's something I think across the board in a lot of very traditional immigrant societies and, Latinx cultures too. And I think just treating children as human beings and like sentient beings that have interests and not just this glob that needs to be formed. That's something it sounds very easy, but in fact, I think we internalize a lot of those behaviors, and it's always I find myself making sure that I don't raise my voice in certain situations, because I remember all these generations of people raising their voice at me when I was growing up, not because they were bad people. That's just, I think, how we were parented.
So let's bring this around now to a broader topic of identity. So let's say if we'd still been living in the Soviet Union, we'd be Russian or Ukrainian or Lithuanian or Latvian speaking Jews. And if we were living in Israel, we'd be Russian speaking Jews. But here we are in America, where Russian is, as we've just discussed, is colonial language, or a language with a lot of baggage, and we're Jews, and we're living in America. So how do we navigate all those separate pieces?
In the past two years plus, I think it's something that I discuss a lot in my own writing group. I think everybody has their own answer. What about you, Alina? How do you navigate it?
That's a great way to turn it back on me. Yeah. Well, the thing is, in my family, not to get into too much detail, but my husband's African American. He has his own culture, which comes with its own baggage and its own. No, it's great. Everything's great. So, in fact, you were saying something about cultures. We're admitting that there's any kind of issues might be considered a weakness. What were you saying about that? So this is something we have actually been cognizant of from the time our children were small, because we wanted to make sure that they understood all aspects of their culture. And it actually got to the point where the kids are sort of making fun of us. Like, we were talking about something in Washington, D.C., and I said, do you know who designed Washington, D.C.? And my kid goes, wait, don't tell me. Was it a black person? I go, yes. And then my husband was asking the kids about something. Do you know who did that? And they go, wait, don't tell me. Was it a Jewish person? So we both clearly take it on trying to make sure.
Takes a team.
Yes, exactly. And so it's something that we're conscious of, but I think it's something you have to be conscious of. And that's actually something I wanted to discuss. I don't think it's instinctive, because it's very easy, especially our generation before media splintered so much. This is going a bit off into the side, but the fact when we had 3 major channels, network of television, and everybody watched the same TV shows, and everybody watched the same cartoons, and if you read comic books, everybody read the same comic books, and all of that, I think it was very easy to get swept up into the mainstream and to just, well, I mean, I was convinced I would be a real American when my house had a banister you could slide down. Because that was the most important thing, because that's what they had on the Brady Bunch, and they could slide down the banister, and we lived in an apartment. So clearly, we were not real Americans. This is a fact. Now that media has splintered, I think it's a little bit easier for people to find, like my kids tell me it's black TikTok, or it's gay TikTok, or it's, something else. So I think people have an easier time finding their identity in the media. But when those of us, it was too easy, you could passively, sort of de facto, into an American culture. But I think what we have tried to do is talk about all the different aspects to our personality. But my question to you is that necessary? Basically, do you have to always be vigilant? Are we in a position where, as parents, if we want to make sure our children understand their culture, is it a case of being on guard and on at all times? And is that really good for you?
Oh gosh, I think that's such a personal question, and I'm really glad that you are doing that and exposing your own kids, or have exposed your own kids when they were younger, littler, to all aspects of, their ancestors and of their cultures and identities. It's very important. Everybody obviously makes their own decisions. I've spoken to, for example, a Bengali woman who she's a professor. Her husband is a professor from India. Their family spoke Bengali. They grew up in poverty, but they were surrounded by poverty, but they went to good schools where they spoke English. And they actually chose not to teach Bengali to their own child, because I think it's not the dominant language, and I think there's also this high status of English, right? And it, which I think is also subsumed in the identity and the feeling like the place where we come from, certain people come from, they don't want to associate with that because it's somehow associated with poverty or negative stereotypes, which also comes again from the media that we consume. I guess in my own case, I think we're in a unique position because, again, we're struggling with a lot of the splintering of the Soviet Union, with the recognition of our own Jewish customs. For example, I didn't grow up celebrating Jewish customs. I didn't know I was Jewish until second grade, when I found out my documents in the file that said Ivrika, and I was like, oh, I thought it was somewhere like in Africa. I told my parents, did you know that I'm Jewish? They're like, who told you? Oh, it's really cool, isn't it? So they took me aside and they had the talk, and I wasn't allowed to talk about it to anybody. Which of course I did. Like, did you know I'm Jewish? Okay. But of course not everybody responded this way, in such a positive way, and then we immigrated. But just as an example, when the war in Ukraine broke out, I had a cousin living in Ukraine and working in Ukraine with a family, so they had to evacuate, and they were able to finally do that. Her own cousin, my other cousin, was living in Moscow. And he and his family, they were protesting, and he was jailed for a few days because of the protest. And after that, so he was like a sympathizer, right? So then he took the family to Israel, and just a few months later, the war happened, and now he's volunteering there with the war relief. So who are we and how are we seen? I think one question is, how are we perceived and how do we perceive ourselves? And the other question is, how do others perceive us? And that's something I think has become very, very traumatic and very difficult topic to discuss for a lot of us. I mean, how many people wear Star of David in public? How many people feel safe doing that? How many people say I'm Russian when they are from Russia? Or how many people now used to say it because nobody knew what Belarus was, right? So they were forced to say they're Russian. So it's very complicated. I think it's going to evolve. And we all are looking for our own identities. If you have an answer, please tell me.
I don't. That's why I asked.